Hello and welcome to this video on the defence of loss of control. Based on the AQA A-Level Law specification, this video is going to cover the partial defence of loss of control, which applies to a charge of murder and which replaced the defence of provocation. We're going to have a look at the key to a good answer, which is to learn the statutory elements really well, to ensure you understand how Clinton has changed the law, and to use the facts of the scenario to support your argument. So we'll have a look first at the bare bones of the defence. It's contained in sections 54 and 55 of the Coroners and Justice Act 2009, and it contains three elements. Firstly, that the defendant lost self-control. Secondly, that the loss of control was attributable to a qualifying trigger. And thirdly, that a person of the defendant's sex and age with a normal degree of tolerance and self-restraint and in the defendant's circumstances might have reacted in the same way. So all three elements have to be proved. So we'll look at each in turn. And the first one is, what is a loss of self-control under section 54? There's no definition of loss of self-control in the Act, and it's for the jury to decide. In the case of Jewell, the court said a loss of control was an inability to maintain your actions in accordance with considered judgment, or a loss of normal powers of reasoning. But in Dawes, they said that serious anger was not enough. So you need to have a look at what clues there are that the person is more than just angry. There must be almost some sort of sense of desperation or being overwhelmed. And if you think about the case of Sands, this is one of the few successful reported cases where loss of control was successful. And in that case, she lost control when the victim smirked at her on his doorstep and said all boys were liars. And this was the final straw for her in finding out that someone she had trusted had sexually abused her children and was proposing to make them testify in court. So those are the sorts of situations in which the defence has succeeded. You need to consider that a loss of self-control does not have to be sudden and temporary, which is what the old law of provocation said. And this was to deal with domestic abuse cases like Alawalia, to take account of the fact that the defence seemed to be favouring men who snapped rather than women who endured and had more of a slow burn effect to their anger. And also that a reaction to circumstances of extreme gravity can be delayed. Lastly, you need to bear in mind that the defence will fail if the jury find that the defendant's actions were out of a considered desire for revenge. So the two things you might think about here: the timing of the attack and the planning. If there is a significant amount of time between the incident suggesting that someone lost control and the killing, this may suggest it was more of a revenge attack, whereas a shorter timescale may suggest that the defendant's actions were not considered or out of a considered desire for revenge. In addition, a lack of planning and preparation may show that it's not a revenge attack because it's not premeditated. So grabbing the first thing to hand might support a claim that you have lost self-control. Conversely, a high level of planning, such as in Jewell, where the defendant arranged for a neighbour to feed his cat whilst he was away carrying out a killing, suggests a cold-blooded revenge attack rather than a loss of self-control. So those are all things to consider in the first element, is there a loss of self-control? Then you need to consider the second element, the qualifying triggers. The first qualifying trigger is the fear trigger. The defendant's loss of self-control was attributable to the defendant's fear of serious violence from the victim against the defendant or another identified person. And this was the defence that succeeded in the case of Ward, where the victim headbutted the defendant's brother, and in response the defendant hit the victim repeatedly with a pickaxe, killing him. This was fear of serious violence against an identified person, his brother. And this shows why there was a change in the law, because previously these types of cases there was no defence available because self-defence wasn't available as they'd used excessive force. But now you can use the fear trigger. The other trigger is called the anger trigger, but covers a lot of words that you do need to learn. And here you have to show that the loss of self-control was attributable to things done or said, or both, which constituted circumstances of an extremely grave character, and cause the defendant to have a justifiable sense of being seriously wronged. And it's important to note that the word character here doesn't mean personality. It's not the defendant, it's not the victim, or it's not any of the other characters who are involved in the story. It just means that the type of circumstances are extremely serious. And in little b, the justifiable sense of being seriously wronged, the word justifiable shows us that this is an objective test. Would a reasonable person, not the defendant, understand why the defendant felt wronged? And the word wronged just means to be treated unfairly, unjustly, or in an unacceptable way. It just means being treated badly. So when you're thinking about the qualifying triggers, you need to be aware that the final trigger may not be the worst thing that's happened, but it might be the last in a long line of things that has happened. And so there can be a cumulative impact of a long series of events. And the really important thing to look out for, because it is quite popular in the AQA exam, is sexual infidelity. And under section 55.6, in determining the qualifying triggers, things done or said constituting sexual infidelity are to be disregarded. And so you can't say someone having an affair is a trigger. It's widely defined, so many situations may fall within the sexual infidelity exception. However, this has been weakened by the case of Clinton. And in the case of Clinton, they said that the jury should consider the totality of the matters relied on, i.e. everything. It might be sexual infidelity plus other things. And they should consider those other things in the context of the infidelity and examine them as a cohesive whole. So this brings in sexual infidelity when you're considering some other aspects, and it's popular in a scenario to include some other aspects. So here is a scenario for you to have a look at, and it's based on previous questions. So you can pause and have a look at that and see how you think you would deal with it. Okay, so if we think about the scenario, first you'd have to deal with whether Jason has lost self-control. And that, as we said earlier, there's no definition of loss of control, and it's for the jury to decide. Jules says it's not acting in accordance with considered judgment, and here Jason angrily grabs the bar stool and rushes over to Ivo. So this might suggest he's not acting in accordance with considered judgment. He also grabs the first thing to hand, a bar stool, and so arguably is not acting out of a considered desire for revenge, as he seems to be acting instinctively. Then you would have to think about the trigger. So you need to identify the things done or said. And here the things that were said was that he was useless, that Kelsey preferred Ivo, that she would take the children with her. And the things done were that she was having an affair with Ivo, and Ivo laughed at Jason about Kelsey and the children. Note, as soon as there is anything about an affair or a new partner, this potentially brings a sexual infidelity exclusion in. So here, Kelsey's affair with Ivo is clearly something that should be excluded, as it is sexual infidelity. And we'll come to Clinton in a moment. Note also that the case of Hatter said that a breakup, so not sexual infidelity necessarily, but a breaking up with someone, is not circumstances of an extremely grave character, shouldn't give someone the ability to use the defence. But Clinton has interpreted section 55.6 to say that if there are other factors, and they should be considered as part of the cohesive whole. So here, the fact that he was useless, she was going to take the children, and Jason laughing at him could be considered as part of the whole story. So you'd have to apply little a and b. Would a reasonable person think the circumstances were serious, i.e. were they of an extremely grave character, and why? And here, arguably a reasonable person might think this was a serious situation, as his wife has said he's useless and that she's going to take away the children. And would a reasonable person understand why Dee felt seriously wronged, that he'd been treated badly or unfairly, and why? And here a reasonable person arguably might also understand why Jason felt seriously wronged, as his wife's new lover is laughing and taunting him about his situation. But equally, you could have counter arguments to that, and you could argue it the other way as well. And you could pose alternative arguments to develop the marks that you get for application and analysis here. So that's the anger trigger. Now let's have a look at the third element, which is called the objective test. So here we're looking at whether a person of the defendant's sex and age, possessing a normal degree of tolerance and self-restraint, and in the circumstances of the defendant, might have reacted in the same or a similar way. And here you have to look at all of the circumstances. What is it that's happened to make this defendant kill? And when you're doing that, it's quite surprising, but the sexual infidelity can be taken into account. Clinton says, yes, here you can say someone whose partner's having an affair. You can take that into account here. However, you cannot take into account something that affects your capacity for tolerance or self-restraint. If it's a mental illness which doesn't affect your capacity for tolerance or self-restraint, then you can take it into account. But if there are any suggestion in the scenario that someone's aggressive when they're under stress or they have strong feelings of despair, then those things have to be ignored. So if you lose your temper or you have anger issues, then this cannot be taken into account here. So it's not whether a short-tempered person would have acted in the same way. It's whether someone in this situation who has a normal capacity for tolerance or self-restraint might have acted in the same way. If you do have mental illness, usually this will be dealt with under the other special defence of diminished responsibility, which is dealt with in another video. The last thing that you can't take into account is intoxication. That was confirmed in Asmalash. If you have a defendant who's intoxicated, that has to be ignored when you're applying this test. So let's see how we would apply this test to Jason. Noting that it's not what a reasonable person would have done. We're going to identify the circumstances Jason is in, and we're going to note that that can include the infidelity. Clinton tells us it can. So here it's arguable a man of Jason's age with a normal amount of tolerance, knowing his wife has been unfaithful and hearing her say he's useless and will take the children with her, and being laughed at about this by Jason, those are all his circumstances, might have responded by hitting him once, but not repeatedly hit him with a weapon, a bar stool, so hard he got brain damage. So you need to decide, are you going to say they pass the objective test or not? Or are you potentially going to give both sides of the story and argue it both ways? When you've done that, you'll have dealt with all three elements. You can conclude that if the defence of loss of control is successful, it reduces murder to voluntary manslaughter, and the defendant will be sentenced at the discretion of the judge up to a maximum of life imprisonment. And it can be life imprisonment if the situation is still very serious. The judge may decide that is the appropriate sentence. And bear in mind that you may also have a scenario with diminished responsibility in it as well. So this applies to both diminished responsibility and loss of control. So the best thing to do to get better at loss of control is to go over your notes, reduce them to the bare bones and learn them. Choose some questions and practice under time conditions, as you will probably have only about 10 minutes to write loss of control in the exam. So it's important that you practice doing it. So here's a reminder of the bare bones that you need to go through. The three elements: losing self-control, attributable to a qualifying trigger, and then learning the triggers, and then lastly the objective test. So I hope that's been helpful. Thanks very much.